And feel free, I'm going to say I put, as you'll see, little sort of subtitle slides in to remind myself to ask questions, but I'm terrible about doing that. So if you have questions as I'm going along, please feel free to raise them. So, as Verna was saying, we did this study on blended learning in a liberal arts college context, and why. First of all, what is blended learning? So typically, blended learning is understood as some sort of combination between online learning and in the classroom learning, right? And then what that means varies a lot from place to place. In some places, particularly at the places where, when we started on this in 2011, and I guess we were writing a grant maybe the year before that, in bigger places, often it means replacing the classroom part, or at least part of it, with the online part, right? So you have fewer in-class hours, less seat time, as people say. We didn't necessarily say that, though. So for our study, when we were thinking about this, and I'll explain sort of why, we decided to define blended learning as a course in which students receive feedback on their learning outside the classroom through some sort of computer-based materials, something online. And it's interesting, we put the feedback on learning in there because, my provost, when she was working on the grant and stuff and talking to different people were saying, well, what about like if my students are watching videos, or what about if they're reading PDF articles online? And she's like, well, okay, no, that's kind of not, we want to go a little bit beyond that. So we figured people were actually viewing things, reading things online. That was our baseline. We wanted to go a step above that. And so she said, no, they have to also be getting feedback somehow on their learning. And then the other thing that we thought was important was that the online component is somehow affecting what you're doing in class. It's not just that you've added these online things, but the two are somehow integrated. It turns out both of those things, which we arrived upon solely by thinking of what kinds of things we want to include in our study, actually are very, very important, I think, for the success of blended learning, and I'll kind of explain why. So unwittingly, we set ourselves up for success in a way. You guys are probably fairly familiar. It sounds like there's a lot of people working with blended learning here, but this is just kind of an example of what we were thinking of. So this is something that geology colleague, Dr. Selby Cull, she teaches mineralogy. Students have to learn to identify minerals, both in sort of their hands, but then also under the microscope slide, so cross-section. And a lot of that, typically you'd go into this class, once a week you'd have your lab where you'd go in and practice, but that was the only time you got practice. And she realized that anything like identification, right, you've got to get good at it. So she thought, well, what if I could do some online things where they could practice and then they could come and test themselves sort of when they're in the lab. So for the visual aspects of this, she developed, we have this great, as it happens, mineral sample collection. And so she took a lot of photos of these, and you can see she's indicating what she wants people to identify. And the student here has typed in sillimanite and got a check, yes, you're right. Okay. This is actually, I'm looking at the instructor view. I've now just scrolled down to the bottom. So this is what that instructor was seeing. So this student, actually put in 10 answers, until she got to the right one. Now, as it happens, they were studying, this could have been one of 10 things. So essentially, the student was guessing, And you can also see the second question that she says, consciously or unconsciously, we identify minerals using a few key characteristics we associate, name the two that you're thinking of. She says radial gray. So the faculty member is getting students, one, to think about why is it that I think this, but then also she's getting a little bit of data on what led the student to think this. And that's also important, as we'll see in a little while. So if you see this, if this student is doing this sort of thing on every single question, well, that's a problem, and that's a certain type of problem when you talk to that student about, hey, what's going on here. Now, if every student is doing this on this particular question, that's a different type of problem. And then the faculty member might, for the next class say, okay, let's focus on this. Or I notice everybody is confusing, serpentine and selenite. Let's talk about how we can tell them apart. Okay, so she's taking the data that she gets from this and either doing interventions with students or changing how she teaches the next couple of classes on that basis. So that's sort of what we were thinking of. Okay, so why study this? Our study actually came out of conversations that the Northeast deans of faculty, provosts, my provosts, were having, where they had been doing some reading about blended learning, all these studies of blended learning, right? And it showed that it would, in many cases, the students and the faculty were more satisfied with that than they were with either an online course, but also with a fully just classroom-based course, right? Greater student engagement, there were evidence of better performance in these classes. Again, both against an online, which didn't really surprise anyone, but against a completely traditional classroom-based course. And they were really sort of intrigued by this and impressed by this. But the problem was all of those studies had been done at really large institutions. Okay, and there were some real questions about, one, if you'd see the same sorts of benefits. So to give you an example, student satisfaction was closely related to the fact that if you're doing the hybrid model or the blended model where you're replacing some of the seat time with online stuff, and you're a commuting student, you don't have to come into campus, you don't have to find parking, right? None of this really applies to our students who are in a residential college. So that was those kinds of questions. Another question we had was, the control courses. So my undergraduate work was at University of Texas at Austin, so I've had the control course with like 800 students, and you're all in this big lecture hall. The biggest course we have is 70. So what's is our control course really similar to the kind of control course that they were testing against? That was a big question. And then the other thing that people were really worried about was this even compatible? Liberal arts colleges sort of sell themselves as, a place where you can get one-on-one interaction with faculty, where you can have very small classes, where you can work very intensely and personally with people. And is this compatible with the whole online learning? That was a huge question. So this grant opportunity came along. My provost, who is now our president, got folks together to commit to it. And basically the idea behind the study, which was funded by a Next Generation Learning Challenges grant, was to encourage faculty to experiment with this, both at Bryn Mawr, which is sort of the lead institution. We would go first. And then we would invite the colleges that were participating to send their faculty. We would talk about what we'd done, and then those faculty would maybe go and do something similar at their own institutions. We initially thought we could convince maybe 4 faculty at Bryn Mawr to do this, but Bryn Mawr, the provost said, there's this opportunity, and 14 faculty jumped up, so we scrambled to find extra funding. Same thing with, we said, well, we could probably convince 10 of the 40 colleges that had signed on for this, maybe we could get a faculty member to teach something like this. And we actually had to turn people away. So we were able to fund only 40 at 25 of the institutions. So one of the things we discovered is it's not that, contrary to popular belief at that time, there was this idea that liberal arts faculty are very, sort of tech Luddites, they don't want to go in this direction. It was really that it's such a time, it requires so much time to get involved, and there's such a hurdle to kind of get going that was the barrier, not necessarily attitude or anything like that. But the other thing that we wanted to do was sort of to collect and analyze some data on these experiments. One, to find out what faculty and students thought about them, and was this in fact compatible with liberal arts colleges? So answer those kinds of concerns. But then also, and it's very hard to do this in a liberal arts college context where everyone's doing something different, especially. But where we could, we wanted to try and do some quantitative assessments of impact. So was there actual impact?
From what I know of assessment, it's important to define your goals first and then design the assessment. And so I'm curious if you were designing assessment to measure just the engagement and satisfaction, or were you looking at student learning gains, in which case you have 40 different sets of goals?
Yes. No, it was the latter. So the impact we were measuring was very strongly conditioned by the grant. The Next Generation Learning Challenges folks were very interested in completion rates. So that was something that we looked at, completion with merit. They were very concerned about, what's the word that they used for persistence. So did the students who took this, did they continue on, and that sort of thing. And they had a real tricky, so we were one of, I want to say like 25, maybe even more, all different kinds of institutions, all different kinds of projects. Some of them were like, more student intervention type things, like counseling or things like this. So they really had a tricky thing in how do you measure all of these things. So that they typically looked at grades, for example. So how many students were performing at a high level versus not. So those were the kinds of things we looked at. We didn't, for example, use a standardized test to determine, like a pre-test and a post-test, right? Now, as I'm going on to do other grants, we're trying to do something like that. The other thing that we were very concerned about, because we didn't, going into this, think that we were going to be able to convince many people to do it. We knew that requiring them to collect reams of data was going to be a high bar, and so we didn't require much. Yeah. So we did do some evaluation, but we didn't evaluate everybody, right, the same way, I think. That was the trade-off. So courses we developed, initially again, and this was kind of the way that the grantors were framing this, we had pitched it very much as a science thing. This is also, I have discovered, a Bryn Mawr thing. Bryn Mawr science faculty are very sort of thinking about how do we graduate women scientists, and so they're very sort of pedagogically engaged in ways that isn't necessarily the case in other fields. On other campuses though, it was other areas that were leading. And so we actually, when it spread to other campuses, we ended up with a very wide range of folks. And I have here a link, so when I share this, you guys can click on and see the courses that we put up, syllabi and things like that. And basically what we found is, yes, that blended learning is consistent with liberal arts college values and experiences, that it does or can at least improve learning outcomes in classes of our size and context. And again, that the barrier to adoption was not a lack of interest on the part of faculty, but more the startup costs, so the time it takes to really get started. So as far as the fit with the liberal arts culture, these are things that sort of faculty and students reported to us, that they felt like, and again, I think this was a byproduct of the way we set this up. We want something where students are getting feedback, right? Okay, the students and the faculty reported that that feedback then enabled better conversations between them, because the faculty member could look out over and know, okay, you're struggling with this, I see that you've really got that, or whatever. So the students and faculty felt like they were having richer conversations. The faculty could give more help because they could look at someone. There's a chemistry faculty member who talks about 2 students who came into his class when he started using this online homework package where the students were doing, rather than problem sets that they'd hand in, they were doing these online problem sets, which meant that for the students, they were getting instant feedback, right? And so they knew immediately, before we went on to the next topic, I don't get this, and they would come into his office. And he said, and they're also coming in, they're not saying, oh, I'm just not science, I can't do this, I'm not a chemistry person, They were coming in and saying, okay, well, I was with you up until you got to covalent bonds, and I'm lost now, could we talk about that? So the questions were better, and then he was able to offer better help. He talks about 2 students who came in at the same time, and they're like, oh, I'm working so hard, I'm just not getting this, and I really, and he looks at their data, and one of them is working, like, say, maybe 3 standard deviations more than most students, and he says, oh, wow, yeah, you're really struggling, let's talk about this. The other student is doing maybe 3 standard deviations less than everybody, who's average, and he's like, okay, as it turns out, this was a freshman, and she didn't that was hard work for her in her high school context, but it wasn't enough, you know, and he was able to say, look, most of your colleagues do have to do this 3 times before they get it, you know, that's part of the process. And that was a different kind of intervention. He said, you know, before this, I would never have known how many hours they were spending or how much time or how many times they tried something. Similarly, I think this was very, very popular with faculty teaching introductory courses, and I think there's a real reason for that. Students come into intro courses at all different levels, and you as a faculty member have no idea how they were taught. Whereas if they come out of your colleague's intro class, you have a sense of what he's doing, right? So for faculty, this was a way to meet the diverse needs of students who are coming in. And as our population is getting more diverse, that's become a bit of an issue. And then the other thing, and I'll talk about this as we go along, faculty were using this or found that it could support some of the other active learning pedagogies that they were trying to do. Okay. Any questions? This is my slide, questions. That's the sole purpose for this slide. So let me kind of walk you through a little bit of that impact that I said. So this was the perception. We did this with faculty. With faculty, it was easier. We just said, are you going to keep doing this? And by and large, everyone said yes. They tweaked it, of course, but pretty much everyone kept going. For students, we asked them, did you think the computer-based materials had an impact on how you were doing? And by and large, everyone thought at least somewhat, some considerably. Very few folks that had negative impacts. People always ask me when they did, what was the negative impact? We followed up with some students that in a class where I knew they were going to have some really negative impacts, and it was a remedial math course. All of them had some experience where they were warehoused in a room, and they said, okay, you're behind, here's the computer, catch up, right? And that was their experience of computer-based learning. So they kind of came in with that idea. Also, the particular things that we were using, and we never found a good package in that particular course, it was very hard to get the computer to understand your answer. So you had to type it in a certain way. And the students, being not very confident in whether they had the right answer, were very frustrated by not knowing, did I just type it wrong or am I getting it wrong, right? And so there was a lot of that. So I think that's an issue. The other common complaint for students, this is a cost-benefit analysis, I think just like it is for faculty. For things like chemistry, where you've got to enter formulas, anytime it's hard to enter your answer, the students are like, I could just do this on paper, it would be so much faster, right? So that's when the benefits of the instant feedback start, you know, the cost of putting your answer in starts outweighing the benefits.
So a follow-up on that point, because I was thinking of exactly that with imagining how I might use a method like this. And I found myself already thinking about how I would have to change the nature of the questions I asked so that the answers would be something that could be dealt with in a formulaic way like this.
Right.
And so have faculty had similar comments about this, and how do you address that?
Yeah, most common, I think, is for humanities faculty, and I come out of a history training, right? You know, I don't ask multiple choice questions. What kind of feedback could you have on an answer in that context? And there I've seen people do different things, do a sort of ask students for their answer and then say, here's your answer should have these things in it, you know, kind of feedback, so a kind of either an ideal answer or did your answer have these things where they can kind of do a self-check. The other thing I know of a guy, Nick Horton at Smith, who was very frustrated. He teaches statistics. All of the statistics packages are these did you get the right answer kind of questions, and he really wants to know, do they have a deep conceptual understanding? So he actually has created his own short answer questions, and what he does is pull them up, look over them really quickly in class, and then do something with that to provide the feedback in class. So that's how he's gotten around that. Yeah, so those are the two ways I've seen for that. Now for, if you're like organic chemistry and students have to draw, things like that, then I've seen sometimes folks will say, okay, take a snapshot and upload that, and I'll just look over the snapshots really quickly, so it's pretty easy to do that with a phone. Otherwise, you have to get into some good software that lets people do that. Yeah, it kind of depends.
I was going to ask a sort of nitty-gritty question along those lines about what software packages they're using. Are these things where faculty are able to sort of master these and create these kind of assessments themselves, or is it becoming a big burden on IT to sit down and every time a faculty member wants to create an assessment?
Right.
That's what for them?
So very good question. I strongly recommend faculty use something that they can edit their own questions in. Because if you have to take it out of a package, then yeah, you've got to wait for somebody to be able to do that for you. So I would say I really encourage faculty to look first for commercial or open source packages that are out there that they can use. And then if those don't work, or if they don't exist in some cases, right, then we start thinking about, okay, how can you supplement that with something you create? And typically they're using Moodle, which is our LMS, for some of the bare bones stuff. Yeah, it's when you get really fancy or when you have, say, Russian, or something. Yeah, exactly. That's yeah, exactly. That's when, sort of the do-it-yourself becomes very, very rough. Yeah, and so then I've seen faculty where they do multiple choice for the things that they create, and then they use like the workbook from a text. For example, I was just helping and talking about startup costs. One of the startup costs I found for many faculty is I don't want to require my students to buy this online textbook supplement if I don't know that it's going to do anything useful. So one of the things that we did was use the grant money to do the pilot, right? So basically I will buy, for your first year or two, the textbook supplement for all of the students. You can try it out, see if it's useful, see if they think it's useful, and then if it is, continue with that. Yeah, but you have to have a good textbook supplement, which is not the case in every, yeah.
Another question?
Yeah.
So research also shows that self-assessment doesn't correlate well with ability, and in lots and lots of different disciplines, just saying, did this help you, really doesn't tell you whether it helped them or not. This is just a feel-good kind of measure. So, did you go past?
Yeah.
That? Okay.
That's my next slide. Yeah.
Just another point to the question about how to deal with not rubric standard plug in the answer kinds of answers. One thing that we've done for ages using the Moodle platform, or even a long time ago on paper with drop-offs, is in my field in literary studies, is have students do brief short answer kinds of very basic. It's and Moodle allows that really easily. And the thing that makes it blended, according to your definitions, is for a Tuesday class to have those due on Sunday night.
Right.
Have everybody read everything, and then respond on Monday night.
Right.
And then in class, you've already had sort of a pre-discussion. That's,
right.
I remember doing this with photocopying and stuff 20 years ago. And that, Moodle is ideal for that. It can be honed and focused. I can pull a good question and compliment a student in public about that the day before class.
Right.
And for courses like the ones that I often teach that have a heavy reading load, this also backs up the reading a couple of days.
Right.
By necessity, because that thing cuts off on Sunday at 5 o'clock.
Right.
And so that may seem obvious.
Learning over time. That's the techie word for that.
But I guess my question broadly for you and for us at Davidson is, am I just naive in believing that everybody does this because it's such an obviously great teaching tool, or not? Because we've had Moodle, and before, we've had Blackboard for a decade almost.
Right.
We've had these kind of tools in place, and it just seems like such a no-brainer to foreground all that, pre-discussion work, at least in humanities courses.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because, so you guys, I happen to know a little bit more about where your campus is, but usually when I show that definition, I say, now, okay, according to and let's do it now. According to the definition I showed, how many of you are doing blended learning? Yes. How many of you would have called it blended learning?
Only to get the grant.
Exactly. Yeah, all of the language faculty when I was first presenting on this, they were like, oh my God, because if you have a workbook, right, if you remember your own language training from way back when, those are all online now, typically. So yeah, there's a way in which we are doing a lot of this without thinking about it systematically or realizing that that's what it is, yeah.
Right. Malcolm's questions, though, about assessing that, the work that I do, that I have called blending in this context, is more difficult because, what's the baseline, and, are they better readers because they have to read and write a day ahead? Or, of course they are, but I can't measure that, right? It's not like I'm gonna section off half the class and not let them participate in the online discussion for a true control.
Yeah, exactly. One thing too I didn't mention, and this came up kind of early on, we said the students have to be getting feedback on their learning in the online piece. We didn't specify where the feedback had to come from, right? So peer feedback is something that a lot of humanities folks, to get that sort of more in-depth, I think, have gone through. I think for a lot of humanities faculty too, and actually this is probably true of everyone, I have an art history faculty member who realized when she was she was in a teaching and learning sort of seminar thing with colleagues from the sciences, and she realized that there was a lot of, they were worried about how we give the students this sort of introductory conceptual information that they can then use when we're doing lab work, when we're doing sort of more stuff. And she realized that in her discipline there was a ton of this sort of introductory skill, kind of stuff, conceptual. For example, she teaches medieval art, so if you don't know the Christian saints, you're really up a creek, So she was like, oh, wait a minute. So it's made her rethink actually what is the relationship between content and skill, and maybe there is more content here that I wasn't really thinking about, and I wasn't really thinking about how the students got that, And so that's another thing that's been interesting, I think, to come up. So we did look at impact, ways of measuring impact. And so I would be the first to say that my boss at the time, Kim, our provost, is a not educational psychologist, although she teaches that. She does early education, early childhood development, and very nervous about calling what we did research, but nonetheless, we did look at, again, our grant organization was very interested in completion rates. So completion with merit, which means 2.0 or higher, that you need to get credit and move on. So we looked at that, and one thing that we did know was that we had an issue with, so about 83% was our completion rate for non-blended STEM courses historically. And we did want to raise that because Bryn Mawr is one of our sort of founding missions is to train women scientists. And so we knew that intro courses were a stumbling block for many students. When you looked at the merit completion rates for all of the courses, it was 85%, which is quite high. But the gateway STEM courses, where that was something that people were specifically addressing, was much higher than normal. Okay, but what does that tell us? So we thought, okay, well, let's compare that to historical norms. There were only 4 courses, and this is the problem of a sort of let every flower bloom type grant, where we actually had, they were taught consistently enough and similarly enough over time that we could actually go back and look and see how does this match up. And in those courses, the average grade was about a standard deviation higher. The merit completion rate in those 3 courses, 3 of the 4 courses happened to be 100%, which was quite a bit higher than the norm. One course, average grade, right about where it was, and the merit completion rate was actually lower. So, and this raises the question, the faculty know that they're part of a study, are they grading differently? Who knows? Also, faculty change over time and things like this. So, were I to do that again, and the ones that we're working on, like we're doing just a psychology one now, and we are thinking about pre-test, post-test, where we can gather something a little bit more concrete. But we looked at what students were doing in the online package, and one nice thing about a lot of these online packages is they give you data. Data on how students are interacting, data on how long sometimes, data on how many hints they asked for, this kind of thing. So we just looked at how much of the required homework the students did and what their final grade was. And we found, no surprise, that there was a very strong correlation, right? Okay, significant correlation. And actually, if you looked at the undergraduates for whom we had, this course had some post-backs mixed in, but for the undergraduates, we had their SAT math scores. If you look at their SAT math scores, that predicted about 30% of their final course grade. If you added in how much of the OWL and just the required parts that they completed, that was like around 60%, yeah. So basically, students who do their homework did better in the course, right? Wow. I mean, it was like, it's a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer for us, but it's, those faculty actually show this graph to the students, okay, now, and say, hey, this is not rocket science, right? They show these, they have to explain them, but they show the data on, it's not just you came in better prepared. You can actually move beyond that. So this raises the question, is blended learning really the cause here? I think a lot of this, the blended learning, and this gets back to the way that we framed the question, right? I think a lot of this is good teaching. And I think we had unintentionally framed our question in a way that highlighted good teaching. If you did a paper and pencil study, you might find the same thing, right? The students who did their homework consistently did better. It's a lot harder to do a paper and pencil study. So the data makes it easier for us to look at these things. So that's part of it. But I would also say that you can look at sort of learning science, which is a kind of cognitive science / pedagogy field, kind of comes out of computer science. There are some mechanisms maybe behind these observed effects, and we can intentionally sort of amplify them. So that's what I want to talk about next. Any questions? Okay. Hypotheses about does blended learning work? This is a huge hypothesis out there in the literature if you have done a survey, which I have. One thing that's very interesting about this hypothesis, when people, often they throw this out as a hypothesis without any sort of follow-up data. So it does remain kind of a hypothesis. And when there is follow-up data, it's usually students reporting, I spent more time. Okay. So I'm a little, but I have talked to faculty in some areas of the country, non-selective schools, where they really think this is important. And maybe in some context it is, I don't know. But in our case, the faculty were really concerned about giving students more work. So I tend to be a little leery of that one. The second hypothesis, and this comes out of later studies where, the first studies, there was all this research about blended learning, it's so great, it does all these wonderful things. As more and more people have done it, there have been instances where blended learning hasn't been all that great, compared to other things. So the second hypothesis that sort of comes out is that blended learning is effective because students are spending better time on task, or when it is effective, students are spending better time on task. I lean more towards this one. And I do because the faculty in our study and on our campuses use blended learning to add opportunities for formative assessment. And if you think back to how we defined the problem, the thing of study, right? We sort of unintentionally, again, built that in. And it turns out, not surprisingly, that's a good thing. So you guys, formative assessment, when I say this, anyone want to throw out a definition?
Just checking to see how you're doing.
Right, yeah. So one, it's you're getting information on how a student is doing to help the student. So here's an example of an explanation of a wrong answer, right? No, you're thinking of this, it's actually X. And actually it, pushing them into another, okay, let's review kind of question. It's also used in literature about teaching and learning to talk about assessing a program or assessing a way of teaching or things like this. So you collect data to look at how you're, whether this is working kind of thing, right? So in faculty get those kinds of data as well. Okay, so why is formative assessment so important? Have you guys heard of the testing effect? There's a big flurry about it in the New York Times, I remember when I was in graduate school, so many people have. It's this idea that being tested on something, being asked about something,
forces you to sort of retrieve that information, and it helps build the actual neural connections that make it easier for you to retain that information, to organize that information, to use that information. Okay? Now, one thing people get hung up, I think, on the idea of testing. When I say testing, you might think standardized tests, multiple choice, right? They actually use retrieval practice. So it's anything that prompts you to recall information. So if I ask you a question, basically, right? And the testing effects works irregardless of feedback. So even if you don't get feedback, there is a measurable effect. But feedback has also been shown to be important. It's obviously, we would think, important for if you're remembering the wrong thing, right? It corrects that. But another thing that's really important is if a student has the right answer but is really uncertain about it, this can reinforce that, and sort of at a neurological level as well as at a sort of conscious level. And again, I think one of the things that might be different about blended learning versus the old way of doing things, the paper problem set, or the small paper, or the short thing, is that you're getting feedback, before the class has moved on significantly. So it's not like you're getting feedback 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, after the midterm. And anecdotally, we know that students are, because of this, going in and asking questions sooner, getting help sooner. The other thing that formative assessment can be really helpful for, and this was exactly what you were talking about, right, is that it spaces learning over time. Students are busy, they have multiple demands, right? When I first started teaching, I remember a mentor of sorts told me, you have to keep yourself on their radar every week, right? Otherwise, they'll wait until you have something due, and then they'll try to catch up and it'll be a disaster, right? This is a common modus operandi for students. And the students recognize it, and in the feedback that we got when we asked students about why do you think this was helpful, a very, very common response was because it forced me to keep up with the reading, or it forced me to, do the problems on time. So, the other thing I think that is so helpful about formative assessment is it can support metacognition. I gave a talk once at a campus where they had done this big metacognition thing, so they were all over. Do you guys, metacognition, does that ring some bells? I see some nodding. This idea of thinking about how you're thinking, right? Experts, if you look at an expert in a particular field, they're very good at sort of assessing where they are, thinking about where the holes are, what they need to learn next, that kind of thing. Novices are terrible about this. And I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name, but the math, Lori and I were just talking about students not getting something out of a textbook, right? So one of the things that students do, and if you compare, this is another thing, if you compare like the sort of testing that this blended learning, if you're using it the way that we've defined it, is doing to the alternative, which for most students is highlighting, right? Highlighting they do when they're novices. They have no idea what they know and what they don't know. Highlighting has been actually shown to have a negative correlation with how well you do later on, Yeah.
I would love when you send us the reference on the highlighting study.
Okay, yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
going to throw that at every
It's not that highlighting makes you learn less. It's an indication that you're learning.
Right.
It's not the act that hurts you.
Well,
It hurts the book. That much.
there's some,
Unstable.
yeah, it's unknown, I think, the way that people have studied it. Yeah. Whether there's a causal relationship there or whether it's just yeah.
I would guess unlike marginalia.
I was gonna say,
Maybe
don't tell me.
Because we, at least in literary studies, we find marginalia of really smart people informative about their thinking and reading and writing processes.
Right.
But their highlighting is useless, right?
Right. Well, and
Or not.
the caveat you had, of really smart people. So
Yeah.
the marginalia, if you go back and look at my marginalia maybe during graduate school compared to my marginalia as an undergraduate, obviously I've moved a step forward and I'm
Right.
asking myself questions and doing things that were different than when I was an undergraduate. So supporting metacognition. So I showed you that quiz, right, where the faculty member said, what made you think this, right? That's a kind of, again, she had taken part in a workshop where they talked about metacognition, and she put that in for that reason, but also because one of the things when this was very new was she was really just testing her photographs too. And so, am I pointing at the right thing? So it was that kind of data, do I have a good question here? Is this a reasonable question? Is this a reasonable photograph? But also to get students thinking about, why did I think this, right? And then they can talk about that. She called these, what does IFP stand for? I can't remember. She called them IFPs. But after every so many, she would give them the survey, basically in Moodle again, just a quick, how easy were these? Okay, and again, that's data for her, but it's also data the students get, they get to see how they rated everything, but then also how their peers rated everything, right? So it's a kind of a sense of where are we, what are we thinking? And then over here, she's asking questions about, she also had these little things that they would go through where she'd say, how confident are you can distinguish between the following minerals? And she'd say calcite versus quartz, right? And they had to rate it on a scale. And then how confident are you can identify any of these properties in a mineral? So cleavage, fracture, parting, what have you, right? And she did those at different points during the class, right? And she's seeing here the sort of average rank that the students gave. And she can also look at the rank that each individual students gave. So again, it's prompting them to sort of assess their own learning in some ways, I guess, as they go along, and assess how they're thinking about things, and assess where maybe they need to do some extra work. But it's also providing her data that she can then say, okay, everybody feels confident with this. And then it's really interesting, and there's an actual, it's an adaptive learning that they're trying to put into, I can't remember, it's a big software publishing company that's just, I think it might be Macmillan, starting to do this, where they ask students a question, and then they ask them, how confident are you about your answer, before they provide the right answer. And then at the end of each section, they show the students, okay, here's your confidence level, here's your actual right level, because they've discovered that students that have a high confidence and are always wrong, that's a different problem than if you're wrong and you're wrong, right? So they're trying to bring that to students' attention, that not only are you wrong, you don't think you're wrong.
That's one way of getting at Malcolm's question or point about self-assessment being not so helpful.
Right.
Right.
And we're usually novice learners, so we're usually, if I were to, ask you guys questions about this, or ask you, did you get what I'm talking about? Most of you would say yes, right? Most of you would be wrong. No, not necessarily. But also, it's in your short-term memory.
Right.
This is the other thing about spacing learning over time. If someone were to ask you about what I had said 2 weeks from now, you might be like, well, there was something about this, but I'm not really sure what that was, So again, that's part of it, right? That you, of course, right after a lecture, you feel like you got it. I always have interesting conversations with students when they get back an exam or a paper, and they felt like they did really well, and it's like, ooh, no, and sort of, let's walk through that. Another thing that I've seen faculty do for metacognition, have you guys heard of classroom adaptive techniques? I think they're pretty common, especially in the sciences, where you, like the minute paper or the muddiest point, what was the muddiest point, what was the point that was clearest, these kinds of things you do quickly in class. There are actually online versions of this in something called the Student Assessment of Learning Gains, or SOLG, which is a terrible acronym. solgsite.org. So I know faculty who have adopted these, you essentially set up a survey through their site and the students take it, but it's those kinds of things. It's the minute papers, it's the funniest point, and you've got some of the pre-programmed, so you just adopt them and put in your questions. The final thing that I think it's the final thing, that makes formative assessment important, and again, this gets to this was hugely popular in intro courses, and it became apparent to us that the big issue in those courses is the different levels of students, particularly if it's a course that relies on math, students have math training. In some cases, and we were talking about this earlier too, it's not that they maybe had bad training, but they had spotty training, or, different teachers over time. Their algebra teacher wasn't great, but their calculus teacher was fabulous, or something like this. So they're a little, or they're just rusty on something. If they're really advanced, sometimes it's been a really long time since they've taken algebra or geometry, these sorts of things. So faculty, I think, use these things or have used them in ways that allow them to differentiate learning. So there's a self-assessment piece where students find out, where they are, and then if they do need more help, they can go on, and if they don't need more help, they can go on to the next thing. So here's an example of a chemistry pre-lab that we set up. For this particular chemistry lab, the faculty member had discovered that if you ask the students about the lab, they could tell you step by step what they were trying to do. If you asked them in chemistry terms what they were trying to do, they had no idea. They couldn't take the concepts, right? They were strictly doing it procedurally. And so, okay, how do we get them to think about the concepts? So that's what this was designed to do. And they're supposed to find the mass percent Fe. They've got a substance, this green crystal over here that they've created, and it's supposed to be a certain thing. To test whether it is what they think it is, they're going to get the mass percent of iron in it. So, okay, first of all, it's been a while since we've done mass percent Fe. What is it, right? If they get it right, they move on to the, okay, how do we calculate it? If they don't get it right, they move on to this question that asks them, and this was the graduate student working with them had discovered this is a good way of doing it. Take chemistry out of the equation. Let's talk about the mass percent of carrots in a particular thing of produce. Then you figure that out, right? Then you move on to a question where it is a chemical formula that you're looking at the mass percent. And then slowly you move your way back here. And students really picked up on this. We found that the students were, whether they needed the extra help or whether they didn't, they were really excited about this because, and in this case, the faculty member had them do this in addition, not in addition to what they normally did. She took away what they normally did to prepare for a lab because she was worried about the extra work. And they said, no, we think we need the traditional lab preparation, but we need this too. And it turns out that they saw how helpful it was, and when it was extra work that they needed, it was okay. If you had given them all a set of problems and not all of them needed this level of detail, that's busy work. That's not something that they're willing to do. But if they're shown, I need to understand this in order to do well in the lab or on the next exam, et cetera, or in the chemistry career that I'd like to do moving forward, then they're willing to go ahead and put in that extra time. But then also the students who don't need this are really, really, really grateful to not have to go through that, right? To know, I know this, I can focus on the other thing that I'm struggling with, right? And help me do this. So for students, it was kind of they never talked about mastery, but they liked the idea that they got feedback on how they were doing before it counted, so before they took the summative assessment, right? And they liked that they only had to do as much as they needed to do. So in most cases, when faculty adopted something like this, you got credit, right, for getting all the way to the end. It didn't matter how you got there, it didn't matter how many times, right? As long as you got to the end, you got 5 points or whatever it was. And they appreciated that. Yeah.
How important is it that there's points?
Very good question. It is important. So one of the things we discovered, and we had 2 chemistry faculty members, one of which had a package, they both used the same package, and then they had another package that was either supplemental. In one case it was just, hey, it's out there, go use it if you want. In the other case, she gave them, I think, extra credit or something for doing it. If you just throw it out there and say it's there if you need it, it's perceived as not important to the class, and they won't do it, right? Or the ones who will do it are the ones who aren't struggling, right? So the message definitely has to be, this is central to what we're doing in class. Points is a very useful way to do that. Another way, though, and this was the other part of our definition, that the two had to be integrated. When students were unhappy about blended learning, it was often because they're doing all this online stuff and they have no idea how it relates to class, right? What they really want to see, and this came out in our conference, actually,
especially conferences where faculty have talked about their experiences, is the faculty member, as you said, sort of take up an example and say, okay, this is what such and such said, or my friend Nick Horton, who does the sort of conceptual things on the statistics, he'll pull up two, and he'll say, okay, you guys, these are the two answers I got to this question. They're mutually, they don't work together, right? Which one is it? And then he divides them up and has them argue it out, and figure it out, and then that's how they get it. So that kind of thing, bringing it back into the class in some ways, bringing up some examples, going through some of the things that people are stumbling across really helps.
Thank you, Jennifer. We'll have time for a few more questions.
Shameless plugs. Everything is up on the website, and then we're also having that conference in May. So if any of you guys want to join us, it's essentially faculty presenting on what they've learned, sometimes IT folks presenting what they've learned. Very informal.
I have a question about how much faculty change what they're doing in the classroom because they are now doing things offline that allows students to assess their own learning. So how much learning?
Yeah, I think it varies from place to place. I think for some faculty, one of the things they said was for many faculty they found this supported the other kinds of active learning things that they were trying to do. So a good example is if you want to flip your class and have students work on problems in class, but you're not sure that they're getting the material enough to do it, right? Then you can have them not only read stuff in advance, but also answer some questions. And then when they come into class, you can do a quick mini lecture on whatever people were having difficulty with. You've already figured that out, right? And then you move into the problem set kind of thing. So that's an example. Another example was we have some intro bio courses where the faculty had it very thematically focused. And one of the dangers was the students were freaked out, the parents were freaked out often, some of the faculty were freaked out that the students weren't getting so for example, to look at, there might be a course on, intro bio course on focusing on cystic fibrosis. Now they're using cystic fibrosis to talk about genetic mutations, genetic replication, protein synthesis, things like that, and how those two things are related. So they are getting those intro concepts, but they don't see that they're getting those intro concepts. And so she had them doing things in the online component where there were different examples, not cystic fibrosis, or there was some basic biology, presented in a very sort of neutral way in the typical kind of intro, here's protein synthesis, here's something else, to make that more obvious to students. And also to make sure that they were getting it, right? So she could say, yes, when you move on to your next course, you will have enough on protein synthesis to be able to pass your med school or whatever. So that was another example of how this has helped. I do know of a faculty member who flips his class where he has them look at lectures sometimes rather than him doing that in class. And he's used things like this to make sure that A, they're watching the lectures, but B, that they're getting from it what he thinks they should be getting from it before they get into class. So I've seen those kinds of ways. Oh, and then the faculty, the mineralogy faculty, right? That's a really boring class. And it's the first class that majors take, right? And then you take some geology courses, but this is the one that if you're gonna major, you have to take. And they really want to get geology majors in there. It's not as sexy. It actually really is a sexy career, but they don't know that, and so they're trying to get them in. And by having them practice all of that online, she was able to bring in other elements into the class. So maybe they'd be looking at a particular chemical structure or a crystal structure. And she'd say, so in class now, instead of explaining that and showing examples and these sorts of things, she could say, okay, now if we know this about these particular minerals, that they all have this common crystal structure, what are the implications for erosion, for example? Or what are the implications for manufacturing? And so that class did a heck of a lot more of that kind of stuff, which is actually the cool, interesting stuff, right, that you need all this foundational stuff for. She was able to bring that a lot more of that in. Yeah.
Isn't
thing that always comes up for me, and I wonder about students complaining about this, is the more we flip, the more we put things outside of class, at what point do students feel like we're basically, doubling the workload? You start to get complaints of, I thought this was X number of hours per week, and now it turns out that in addition to class time, it's not just homework, it's basically, so I'm just curious about that.
Especially if the work previous to this, like reading the textbook, is something that they could skim or skip or, Yeah, so I have known quite a few faculty who have gotten pushback. Why don't you just teach? This is the common one. And particularly interestingly enough, from students who do really well under the old mechanism. So if you're an ace, you know how to go into a class, listen to a lecture, and ace everything. You're going to be you might be flummoxed by this. And I have seen faculty who've had some pushback on that. On the other hand, there are many students who really take to this, So some of it, I think, is what are students used to. Some of it is, and a faculty member brought this up recently, if this is the only course where people are trying to do something like this, then yeah, they're going to be like, wait, every other course that I take, I just go and sit in a chair. So some of it is the more spread this gets, the better. So I know faculty teaching in a field where many people were doing something that required a lot of students in class and out of class, it wasn't as big a deal as the one lone faculty member in the department that says, hey, let's do active learning.
Do they tend to tell the students up front, you should expect to do X number of
I think so.
online
Right.
hours per
Right,
week?
and I think the other thing that's really helpful is to present it sort of as a mastery thing. That as, I don't, you need to do this until you get it, right? And the getting it is the important part. And I think that resonates better with students than I'm just making you do this work online because I'm cool, or whatever. So some of it's that. I think faculty who have experienced some resistance actively share why they're doing this often. So we try and say, look, yes, it's easier for you to come in and me to tell you, but I know, and here's why I know, that you will not understand this as much as you need to with everything out. Now, students take classes for all sorts of reasons, right? So for a student who is taking science, this particular science because they have to, that she might know more when she gets out, may not be that much of a draw, right? So you can't necessarily please everyone. I have also, some faculty and I did a MOOC that was on blended learning. Blended learning is really being picked up in K through 12. It's only just starting, and they are having the same kinds of material issues. What software do you use? As we do, I think even maybe more so. But I think students in, say, 5 years, 10 years will be much more familiar with this kind of